In this episode of Lab Matters with me, Harriet Gould, you'll hear how author Marti Leimbach wrote science into her latest novel and get a little insight into her life as a rat breeder. So today I'm joined by author Marti Leimbach. Marti's written 7 books. And the recent one, the big one, Dragonfly Girl, is critically acclaimed. You wrote that in 2021, um, Marti. Now, you were born in Washington, D.C. and grew up in Maryland. And the reason that you're with us today is because you've actually written a scientist in your fiction, Dragonfly Girl. And so we're going to come on to that. But before we do, let's find out a little bit about you, more about how you grew up, where you're from. So back to Washington, D.C. Hello, Marti.
Hello, thank you for having me. So yeah, I was born in DC, and my father, who died very young, was a lawyer, and my mother looked after us until he died, at which point she became a journalist. And she not only ended up being working as an editor at U.S. News and World Report, but she also did medical writing. So from very early on, there were all these papers around and all these typewriters sort of going. And she worked deep into the night just because it was a freelance job that she needed to pay the bills. And I went to a very, just a public high school, and then on to university, where I was introduced a little bit to science, but always felt very much an outsider to that.
So just to pick up a little bit on what you said about your mother, she just became a journalist. Did she have any history in that?
Well, good question. She certainly studied English, but she also studied some medicine at some point. She was always very vague about her background. She was very well educated, and I think that she had been working in some capacity as a writer before having lots of children, one after the other. And I think when you have 3 children under the age of 5 in the 1960s, maybe that was your job.
Yeah, got it. So at such a point where she returned to perhaps what she'd been doing. So you were introduced to science a little bit, but it didn't grab you. How did you
Well,
feel about it?
I think, I come from I have to say that when I was in high school, you tend to do what you're good at, right? You want to get those grades up. You want to, perhaps you have ambitions to go to university or something like that. And so I was very much sort of more verbally gifted, and my communication skills were very good. I was able to be on the debate team. By the way, you have to study a lot of medical stuff if you're on the debate team in the US, because everything that you do has to end in death and destruction. But every plan you attack has to be because it'll somehow kill people. But anyway, so I did a little of that. But basically, there were kind of two kind of groups of people. There were people who wore calculators on their belts and were very good at math and very good at science. And then there was like me, people like the rest of us who kind of muddled through the math and muddled through the science and felt quite inadequate. And I do think at that time, though it may not, I may be misremembering, or it may have been the case then and now, that if you were a girl, if you felt you were very good at communications, etc., you were kind of steered toward things where you would get high grades, high marks, make the honor roll, all that. So that was me. And I was terrible at math. In fact, I remember when I got into Harvard that my math teacher at the time said, "I cannot believe it." And I cannot believe that you got into Harvard. You're so bad at math. And I loved my math teacher because she was very patient. But I told her, there are other skills.
And well done for saying so. There certainly are. I mean, imagine if we all had to do maths, it would be a disaster. Um, Very useful though it is. So then after graduating, you had a patient teacher, but you were still channeled down a particular route according to your sex, which I
Yeah,
don't suppose would
well,
happen these days, would it? I don't think that's a
I
thing
don't know.
anymore.
I think I really don't know. I think the first thing you have to I mean, I have thought a little bit about this. I mean, To be fair, at Harvard, they did make me do science and I did love it. So it wasn't like the last chance saloon. But if you're going to do well in the sciences, you do have to kind of start early because there's certain prerequisites that you're just not going to easily be able to catch up with. And so, for somebody like me who was precocious in one area, it does mean the exclusion of other things. I don't think anyone sort of told me that. I just felt that. And I think it wasn't even a bad thing. I think there's room, even particularly now, more than ever, perhaps, in the sciences for those with very strong communication skills and an enthusiasm. Because the first part of getting someone involved in science is making them believe they can do it. You have to believe you can do math before you're going to try to do math. You have to believe you can understand science or that you have some potential of understanding science before you're going to engage. So if you have someone maybe like me who's just always quite marginal, which by the way is the position of any writer, of any fiction writer, anybody like that, our position within society is always marginalized in some way. That we are outsiders looking in, and that is our strength. So I would say that somebody like me who is very reverent to science, very respectful of science, very respectful of scientists and their endeavors and their persistence and tenacity. Actually, an enthusiast has their place. It's not a bad thing. And I would never want to characterize how I behaved as a teenager or as a young adult or now as in any way a victim of anything, because I think that somebody in my position is in a great place to be that enthusiast for those who are doing the work.
Couldn't agree more. Well said. Very well said. So then you graduated and you really were sort of going down the writing route, shall we say? Is
Absolutely.
that true?
Yeah,
Or
absolutely.
yeah.
I mean, I did some science at Harvard. You have to. And one of the great things about American liberal arts colleges, as we call them there, at universities at undergraduate level, is that they quite often will require you to do this kind of range. And so at Harvard, which was a miracle I got into in the beginning, I should mention the only reason I applied to Harvard, literally the only reason, is because they were so generous that they waived my application fee, unlike all the other universities that did not. So the Ivy Leagues would actually, they're so well endowed. They're like, yeah, if you don't have the money, just have your guidance counselor sign this form and you don't have to pay the $50, which was what it cost. So I'm like, well, I'm going to apply to all of them because that's just a freebie right there. And then I was amazed to everyone was kind of amazed I got in, frankly. But the point is that at Harvard, I was introduced to some science. You had to take it. I was so nervous of the statistics course. So I was convinced I would fail, and you could not at that time graduate without passing it, that I taught myself statistics using their at-home program over the summer. And then I took this great course by this guy, was a professor of anthropology and an evolutionary biologist named Irvin DeVore. And I fell in love with his class completely, but I was not of the status that some of these people were. No way could I be part of that. So I was a writer, and I was a good writer. I mean, I am a good writer, but then these days things have changed. And so just bringing us up more to the present, I've just felt so drawn to science because it is out there. It is available. You can read all the papers online. You can learn about stuff. We've got these great documentaries, et cetera. So science is kind of everywhere. And as it became kind of everywhere, the divisions within, say, fiction of like science fiction versus adult fiction over there and YA over there, all this kind of blurred. So in the old days, science fiction or speculative fiction was always kind of about outer space and aliens and galaxies and things over there but now science is small, it's in our pocket, technology is in our pocket, and it's personalized. So it becomes part of the daily drama. It becomes part of our lives in a different way. And I think that's one of the reasons that I wrote Dragonfly Girl, which is, of course, about a girl who is a scientist and kind of bringing in all this real science. I mean, it's a work of fiction, but it is drawn so much from, it's just informed by real work. And it's not a stretch to bring that in anymore because it's all there and available to us as writers.
And you've had pretty good reviews, very complimentary on the work as a whole, and quite specifically, there's one review that says that you handled the science well. And
Shocker. I think I did. I mean, I have a whole acknowledgments section in this novel, which is unusual for a novel, in which I like tell everybody where I got this information from and websites in case they want to go and look. So I didn't make this stuff up. I did make up the core details. So, I sandwiched all this real science is on the outsides. And then there's this thing that I kind of made up, which is that Kira, who is my heroine, feeling terribly guilty and responsible for having allowed a very precious lab rat to die, kind of borrows some good ideas of her colleague and manages to bring it back to life. And it's this movement of where she has really changed, moved the dial on what death is and whether death is final. And by doing so, that's the thing that isn't quite real, although it is getting realer all the time. She kind of has this, quote unquote cure for death. That's how it's seen. She's elevated into the limelight. That in itself becomes a kind of endangerment for her own life, which is the thriller part of the book, the fiction part of the book. But in fact, it's interesting because the ability to the medical advances that we have, who are they for? If we really did have a situation in which death wasn't quite as final, or certain grave diseases aren't nearly as final, depending on who is treating you, then who are those technologies for? Who is benefiting from this? And that is something that has always interested me, and it should interest everybody because that's where we're going.
indeed, an existential conversation to have at some point. So it wasn't your first book. We know that now. So I mean, have you've got a slight interest? You've mentioned that Kira was worried about the rat dying.
Yes.
And that's more significant than your letting on.
Yeah. Okay. So I
You've
have
got
my
an
own
interest.
I have my own little hobby, which is, in fact, I happen to be drinking my tea from one of my many rat mugs that have been have
Oh
been a
yeah,
gift
right.
from people over. I have a wonderful friend who's a great enthusiast for my rats. I'm a rat breeder. On a very small scale. I'm a hobby breeder as part of the National Fancy Rat Society here in Britain. And I love breeding rats. My mother worked with lab rats at some point. I mean, it's very difficult with my mother, who's extremely neurodiverse and who's been dead since 1989, to really know what happened. But she told me long ago that the lab rats she knew were wonderful. And I kept that in mind, and somehow ended up in a pet shop seeing a rat. And eventually I ended up having rats and rescue rats and breeding rats and studying rats, the ethology of rats, which itself is perhaps off-putting to some people, but they're kind of really important. We don't even know how many mice and rats we have in labs right now, by the way. But they are that ubiquitous. They're kind of everywhere.
Mhm.
My rats live like kings and queens, and I am terrible about, I joke that nobody's good enough to have my rats, but it's true. My pet homes have to apply in this 8 or 9 page application. They have to have everything there, all their equipment approved by me. And then if they're very lucky, I might have a few rats for them.
How many rats have you got at the moment? So you've got your stud rats. They're the ones
I
that you
have my
keep.
stud rats.
Yeah.
I have not that many right now. I have probably about 16 or 17 rats. I'm expecting a couple of litters, I hope. And I'm doing a little experiment of my own now, though, of course, legally you don't do experiments on rats. It's completely wrong. But this isn't really an experiment. This is just a sort of breeding idea I had, which is to try to use one of my rats who has enormous longevity and see if that might change the dial on how long my rats are living, because you're supposed to obviously breed for temperament, you breed for health, and then you breed for the aesthetics, the appearance of the rat. So largely breeders who show rats do that in the opposite order, but I'm really into the temperament and the health of my rats, and I don't like to see them die young, or even average lifespan. So
And
what I'm
what is an average lifespan of, let's just
well,
get a context.
it depends on the strain of rat. I should say, because there's laboratory rats of different Wistar rats and Sprague-Dolius. There's all these different rats, but my rats, pet rats, the kinds of rats that you fancy rats you'll find in the UK, bred by national fancy rat breeders, would probably live somewhere between, say, 23 to 28 months. 28 months is pretty old, actually. If you get them to 24 months, you're kind of fine. But this rat is 31 months, and he's a buck. Now, you cannot breed the does, the female rats, when they're old. That doesn't work too well. They just don't get pregnant or don't produce live young. Not that I've tried, because I wouldn't, but you can breed the bucks if they're in good shape. And he's marvelous. So he's 31 months. He came back to me having outlived his brothers from a wonderful pet home locally, who looked after him very well. And I just bred him to two of my girls, because I really want to see if whatever those genes are that kept him alive and well and running around as he is now, can perhaps influence my line. And this is the kind of thing hobby rat breeders do. We try and improve the health and I mean, my rats are like dogs. They run to me, literally run up my legs to get to me. They're a little like having puppies, actually.
Hmm.
They're active.
Hmm. I had rats at school. We had class rats, and I at
Yeah.
one point took them home unannounced for the holidays. That didn't go down particularly well.
To your parents. What did your
Yeah,
parents
they weren't thrilled. No, my mother was horrified. In fact, really, really horrified.
Yeah,
Um,
people feel that way.
yeah, like livid. In fact, I think. But I looked after them. They were wonderful, friendly things, and it didn't. I didn't. Her rage didn't seem to bother me either.
Well,
But yeah, they were very friendly rats. Really wonderful. Yeah, so I completely understand your description of them as puppies. They're very
and
puppy-like.
and they're quite popular. I mean, I have a TikTok channel which I started out. It's called at Marti Writes, and it was supposed to be to promote books, because it's ridiculous because the biggest introverts in the world tend to be, fiction writers, and nonetheless we're supposed to sort of be, hold whole marketing campaigns on our own, kind of 24/7, 365 days a year. And so there I was on TikTok trying to write about writing or talk about writing, and I was so bored. It really was just, I just get bored of talking about, this is my book, buy it. I'm out of social media ideas, just buy my book. So anyway, I started putting my rats on, because Dragonfly Girl has a rat, and it has lots of rats in it. So this became very popular. So suddenly I went from whatever number to 25,000 or whatever it is, of people saying, oh, please show me more of your rats. So
I'm not
so
surprised.
I
I'll be
do.
following you immediately after this. Marty
I learned
Wright.
a lot about rats and about how I look after my rats, because one of the things I'm trying to demonstrate is that, I mean, I'm not even sure how I feel about having animals in cages in here. So I'm trying to show, if you're going to have an animal in a cage, which is a big if, how are you going to do that so that everyone's happy? Um,
Hmm.
and I do think that, pets are very good for people. I mean, they're very important to us, and they're not going to go anywhere. So what I'm trying to do is demonstrate some excellence in, even in breeding. Breeders have so many, but all my rats come out at least twice a day, and they all play with me every day without exception. And I don't know very many people who do that, but then, it does mean sacrifices in other areas of your life.
No cats in the house.
No, well, no. Although I have cats patrolling the house.
Guarding the
Not
rat.
mine. They just come.
How interesting. I wonder if they can smell them.
I don't think so. I think they just are fighting for territory because it's a catless house, and it's a dogless and catless house. And the cats are just like, wow, this is a turf war. So yeah, they're quite entertaining, actually.
So, did you say I probably interrupted you? Did you say how many rats you've got at the moment?
I think I'm about 16. I always keep it under
16,
20 if
right.
I can. When I breed, it can be any number though, because you're getting a litter. A litter can be anything from 0 in a complete disaster to 16. The most I've ever had, I think, was 19, but then a couple of them die usually when that happens, because of course a mother rat at best will only have 12 nipples. So how she does it, I don't know, but watching rats, I mean, these are Rats are amazing. I mean, they survive kind of like extinction events, right? So feeding 17, yeah, they're gonna do that.
Just yeah, yeah, easy work. So gosh, 16 rats, and you've got two who are pregnant right now.
I hope there may only be one who's pregnant. We'll see. But
Okay. And when is she or they due?
well, it's an average of 22.5 days gestation, and so I think I've got another 12 days on one and kind of 18 days on another. But I didn't actually see mating on one of them, so I that's why I bred the second.
Okay, so we all need to follow your TikTok account to find out how these litters come to term and
Oh,
how
they'll
they
be
are. Yeah,
gorgeous.
wonderful. Can't wait. So, I mean, yes, big passion for rats, but then the writing and then the slightly surely the nature of the research that you had to do is slightly at odds with your passion and care for the species. And then you had to go into, and find out about lab rats and what goes on in that
Uh,
context.
I don't. There is a lot of work actually on the care of laboratory animals, and of course on lab rats, which used to be excluded from certain welfare acts, which I think now they are of course included mice and rats. It has improved a great deal, but I didn't dwell on that. I mean, mostly my research that I did for this really had to do with whatever was happening in the book, and it was very important to me, and it continues to be important to me that to make the science in it, and there's a lot of science in there. Somehow very much part of an ordinary life so that people don't feel that there's scientists over there, we don't know what they do, they're not us, and we just draw from them in whatever way we can. Somehow it's almost like a kind of making science exotic and scientists sort of exotic and different and other. I don't think that's served us very well
Hmm.
as a race. I think that human race really needs to understand that scientists are all of us, that we are all doing science all the time, and that it's accessible and that it's for us or not. And that also it's really the ethics involved are fascinating. And I think everyone, if you watch, that everyone's kind of a scientist. They want to be in some ways because they cook, because they involve themselves in spring watch and autumn watch, because they got and count how many invertebrates are in a patch of grass or whatever they are doing. There's a huge interest, of course, in naturalism, and naturalist writers doing very well. They write beautifully. I read them. So and I don't think that's new, but understanding that science is for all of us, I think, um, is just increasingly, that's where we're going, that's where things are. and
Hmm.
and I think all of us will feel much more that way. But with that comes kind of more exclusion in the terms of the science has become so complex that only some people are able to do it. You think of AI, for example, and in Silicon Valley, luring these people who can deal with these giant data sets, et cetera. How do you get the human resource? How do we get the brain power in there? And that I like to deal with. So I've dealt with that in Dragonfly Girl. And again, in the sequel to that, which I one day hope will come out, called Academy One, how, what is the bottleneck? And sometimes the bottleneck really is the application of brain power and human resource to a problem. And then who gets to benefit from that? So are we going to learn all about, say, robotics only to make weapons? Let's hope not. So there's just a lot of information. There's a lot of stuff out there for a writer, anyone with an imagination, to just get excited about, I suppose.
Hmm. I couldn't agree more. Um, I just wonder when you have been doing research, has there been anything that's really stood out to you that really sticks in the memory when you've been either reading papers or visiting places, labs, talking to people? Was there one piece of advice or one comment anything that really stuck out that
I
sticks
think
with
one of
you?
the things is just because of how old I am, I'm 61, and I remember when we were told things that were not true.
Right.
So then you come to today and they're like, oh, no, 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 that's not true at all. So for example, regeneration of brain cells. we understood that just did not happen. That, when brain cells died, that was it. They were gone. Goodbye. And now we know that there can be a neurogenesis, that we can have brain cells develop. And what does that mean? So understanding this, I think that the thing that's really struck me as I've read is understanding that the history of science is a kind of hero's journey, that it doesn't, it's been like a progression and terrible mistakes, terrible swerves the wrong way, where we did crazy stuff. If you think about the book The Emperor of Maladies, where some devastating cancer treatment was offered to people, and we don't do that anymore. Just reimagining the body has to happen a lot. I think we have to do that a lot. We have to reimagine certain medical practices, medical assumptions. Practitioners don't always have time to do that because they're too busy doing their clinical work. How do we move the progress along when the people who are actually giving the advice and writing the prescriptions are literally run off their feet? Like, they're not even sleeping and not looking after themselves. How do we do that? Well, that's something that's really been...
have to give them a robotic assistant or something.
Or at least an assistant. That would help.
Yeah. I just wonder, when you say not true, it wasn't that people were deliberately spreading untruths. It was
No.
simple case of that being the conventional belief at that time, based on what
Absolutely.
people had discovered.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's a practice, and there's a
Yeah.
reason why things are a practice, is because you don't know. But we had some ideas about certain things. I mean, I can remember at Harvard being taught kind of I remember somebody standing up and talking about schizophrenia, for example, a devastating disease of young people quite often. It starts young, and being told, as though it were true, that there is this mother involved, that there's a cold mother, or a cold, that was sort of Freudian. I think they were doing this sort of like cold breast and the warm breast, and the mother did this, and all sorts of nonsense. And I remember thinking, even at the time, I mean, as a 20-year-old, thinking, wow, I mean, moms can do a lot, but they can't do that. I just don't believe that. And yet that was being talked about. Or Bettelheim's theory about autism or something. This was the mother, that you had this I think unloving, cold mother, and this ineffective father. This is just so completely wrong. And yet, and then when I had my own son, who is most very definitely on the autistic spectrum, and discovering, like, literally everything they were saying about autism was like either half the truth about him or not true. So they would say that I remember being told by a nursery school teacher, and I'm sure that they had been taught this, that he didn't love me, he just needed me, and that's why he was wanting to be with me. Or that he didn't have any theory of mind, which was not true. Or that he didn't have a sense of humor, not true. Or they didn't feel emotions the way other people do. In fact, he feels them, I think, more strongly. Or that he would never have language, or if he did have language, it would just be functional language. There would be nothing more to it than that. Absolutely not true. So he speaks about 8 languages. All sorts of things that they assumed, and that they had read and been instructed and taught about him, just weren't true. So I had to find my own truth within that very singular, poor sampling of one, which was my beloved child. And I never really believed things after that. People would say, oh, whatever, after a certain age, you can't learn a language, or whatever they'll say. And I thought, none of this is probably true. And I understood that, I mean, I always get made fun of. In fact, I get belittled, and I'm sure some of your listeners may too, if they go to the doctor and they've been to, quote, Dr. Google, and looked up their symptoms, and they ask the doctor about that, and the doctor says, did you read that on Google? And you say, yes. They say, well, we don't do that. And I'm thinking, really, why not? Why not? Why is it so exclusive that I'm not even allowed to read about my own symptoms? That asking you for an additional blood test is somehow inappropriate. Well, again, these are these lines that we've drawn. Who's entitled to have an opinion about something scientific and who's not? And there's good reason for that, which is that experts actually know something, but the experts are accessible these days.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're allowed to go to Google and look up the experts.
Yes, that's one of the advantages of the internet. That and being able to order your book.
If you wish.
And doing this podcast as well. That's down to the internet too. So yeah, I mean, I think it's brilliant. One of the reasons that I love doing this is exactly that, to bring more people to thinking about science and understanding that different aspects of it are accessible to them, that's your overarching, I guess, motivation with the book, and making it as that part of one. We're all part of it, and there are no segregations when it comes to what we can learn, even if we just learn it as a hobby
Well,
and
that's a good
become
place to
literate.
start.
Yeah,
How do you know that
yeah.
you like something and want to do it for a career if it's not even allowed to be done as a hobby? Or also within school, how about if you're allowed to do things badly? So if you like something and you do it badly, why is that a problem?
Mm,
Why not just do that?
good
Because you
point.
won't always do it badly. People don't learn in the same developmental style as each other, and especially when it comes to science. I think that we all have a different developmental profile when it comes to these kinds of things, and our development should not impede anything about our interest in acquisition of scientific information.
Hmm. I think that's quite a profound statement. Different developmental style, and that can happen at any time in life.
Absolutely, yeah.
Fascinating.
In fact, it's people who decided they can no longer access that and that they won't access that, I think, who lose out, you know.
Mm.
Um, so that's and also I just like the idea, even if it's not true, because it's almost like a intellectual placebo effect. So let's say you can't learn after a certain age or whatever. Let's just pretend you can, because I'll bet you that just that imagining will benefit you greatly.
Mm. And it doesn't have to stop at academia, because I learned to swim 2 years ago, and I've all my life not been able to swim, and I still couldn't when I first began to try, but I'd already entered the event at that point. So I had to learn, and I
You,
did. I just did.
I believe you. My husband did his first marathon in his 50s, I think.
Fabulous. We
I
cannot,
know. I
yeah.
started weightlifting when I was almost 60. Mostly because nobody told you, and this I did learn from reading papers, that if you want to stave off osteoporosis, best thing you can do is lift heavy weights.
Yeah.
You're a
Yeah,
woman, get out there and lift weights.
exactly. So this sequel to Dragonfly Girl, Academy One, it's not out yet. I hope it will be. You hope it
Oh,
will be. We all
I
hope
hope
it
it
will
will be.
be.
Yeah,
Can
I
you?
don't, it's not the flavor. I have to say, Science Girls are not the flavor of the moment for publishers, but Academy One is a thriller. And what's interesting about that is it really does push further this idea that because of the potential for science, there's also the potential for the misuse of children and teenagers and young adults, to have them use their intellectual power, their development in ways that are perhaps dangerous for mankind. And that's what Academy One is about. It's a secret academy in which there's some wonderful science in there, but not all of it's being used for great reasons.
Excellent. Well, I will keep my fingers crossed that makes it onto the shelves before long. And yes, I'll read Dragonfly Girl as well, and of course follow you on TikTok immediately. That's the first thing I'll do. Watch these
Those
rats.
those rats cannot be unobserved, They
Exactly, exactly. Marty, it's so much fun talking to you. I hope we can do this again. And thank you again for your time.
It's been my great pleasure. Thank you.
Did you enjoy that episode of Lab Matters? If you did, please do send it to the people that you think will enjoy it the most.